Amidst the cold grey stones lying dormant on the Champagne plateau of France, there exists a narrow fissure no wider than a line on a palm. For centuries no one noticed it, a seemingly meaningless crack in the wall of time. Yet from that very fissure, a silent stream began to seep into history, twisting through dynasties, slipping past the boundaries of reason, and leaving behind whispers that defy naming. In the year 1119, while darkness still cloaked the Holy Land after the First Crusade, 9 men clad in white robes, vowing poverty and obedience, gathered beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, a name so humble it nearly erased them from the world's gaze. And yet in that sacred and tumultuous place, they laid the cornerstone of a structure that would grow like a nightmare or an undeniable creed. There was no grand ceremony, no tolling of church bells, no full record of their vows, only darkness and a promise. But from that darkness emerged a half-monastic, half-military order, rising like a smoldering flame, quiet, enduring, demanding absolute obedience, and harboring in its silence enough power to shake both throne and papacy. At first they were merely tasked with protecting pilgrims traveling from Europe to Jerusalem. But soon their real strength lay not in swords or steeds, but in contracts, lines of ink on parchment, and a hidden order they crafted and concealed. Within decades, the Order of the Temple owned fortified castles, silver mines, and private roads. They were exempt from taxes answerable only to the Pope, and no one knew exactly when they began to possess something that no one dared name. Administrative records from the 12th century show the Templars ran a money transfer system across territories akin to a modern bank. But that was only the surface. What puzzles historians is not the scale of wealth, but the absence of records. Cold voids in the Vatican's archives, letters that never arrived, manuscripts burned for reasons unknown. Something once existed, a map, a formula, a creed, or an object forbidden to be named. Some modern theories suggest they found the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the 10 Commandments. Others believe they guarded the true bloodline of Christ, a lineage that made the divine human. But none can prove it. And in that ambiguity, everything begins to tremble. One day someone noticed a nearly invisible detail. All suppression of the Templars never began for religious reasons. They began with a financial need. King Philip IV of France owed them an enormous debt, one he could not repay. So instead of paying, he destroyed. And to destroy, he needed a reason. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the king's soldiers quietly arrested every Templar in France. No resistance, no bloodshed, only an eerie silence of souls resigned to fate, as if they already knew, as if it was part of their design. From that moment, the fear of Friday the 13th was born not from superstition, but from a real annihilation written in blood and fire. Inquisition records contain strange confessions. The knights were accused of worshipping a speaking head, an idol called Baphomet, whose exact form remains unknown. Some ancient carvings found in Aragon archives describe it as half-human, half-beast, and half-mind, an embodiment of perfect imperfection. If they did venerate such a figure, was it heresy, or a knowledge beyond the language of its time, a forbidden truth? 9 years after the arrests in 1314, The last Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned alive in Paris. Before dying, he uttered one final sentence, almost inaudible: "All will come in the darkness." No one understood. No one wanted to. Yet within that same year, both King Philip IV and Pope Clement IV, the chief architects of the Templar downfall, died unexpectedly under mysterious circumstances, leaving no heirs. History says nothing more. It only falls silent, as if something remains unwritten, untouchable, unforgivable. And from that silence, strange movements emerge. Secret chambers beneath ancient churches, symbols alien to Christianity carved deep into Gothic stone, a bloodline flowing against the tide of time, a hand withdrawn, but still holding the key to a door yet unopened. No one knows when that small fissure began to widen. But by the time it was noticed, it had already split through the vertical axis of history, and at its far end lay an unnamed void where a single tear has yet to fall. A suit of armor is never merely a form of protection. It is an iron mirror that reflects fear, a second skin forged from hardened belief. When the Knights Templar donned their white cloaks bearing a crimson cross, they didn't just step onto the battlefield, they entered another dimension of reality. A reality tempered by faith, bent by vows, and nailed into place by silence. No one truly knows where they learned to fight. No records describe their training methods in detail. Only legends remain. Yet within a mere century, the Templars became one of the most disciplined fighting forces in Europe. They did not laugh. They spoke no words during meals. They never turned when called from behind. They moved as if they were not individuals, but a single will, an invisible central force in motion. Their power did not stem from technique. It came from structure. Each knight was a brick in a greater whole. If one cracked, the entire edifice had to be replaced. They accepted being burned alive without protest, but were ready to behead a brother at the first sign of wavering faith. Within such absolute boundaries, something took shape: an unspoken religion, an idea that belonged neither to scripture nor to blood. In 1129, the Council of Troyes, under the influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, officially recognized the Templars as a monastic order with weapons, a contradiction both aesthetic and philosophical. For to be a monk is to renounce, to be a warrior is to possess. Yet here the two poles merged. And when opposites fuse, they often give birth to an energy that cannot be measured. Why Bernard? A saint of austerity and contemplation, who once wrote, "The light of truth doesn't come through words, but through the empty spaces of the mind." He was the one who authored in praise of the new knighthood a manifesto hailing the Templars as warriors of the soul. Not merely soldiers, not merely monks. They were intermediaries between heaven and earth. Instruments of what has never been spoken. Bernard experienced hours-long ecstasies. In a handwritten letter preserved in Cîteaux, he described a strange dream, a stone tower in the desert, no door, no entry, yet glowing with light. A light with no source, only presence. A few months later, he chose to endorse the Templars, without a single explanation. By the mid-12th century, Templar castles rose from Iberia to the Levant, from England to Armenia, yet their architecture contained peculiar traits. Corridors often turned at 3, 4, 5 angles, a geometric ratio found in ancient Egyptian engravings. Watchtower windows were tilted 23.5 degrees, off true north, matching the Earth's axial tilt. Coincidence? Or signs of a knowledge ahead of its time? Architectural scholars have proposed that these castles were not built solely for defense. They were colossal stone bodies where sunlight moved along calculated paths to strike specific points in the year, moments like the vernal or autumnal equinox. Some of these intersections of light aligned with embedded symbols, a bisected circle, a six-pointed star, a key. None belonged to the Christian canon. Were they hiding something within the very form of their strongholds? A 13th-century manuscript now held at the University of Salamanca records a conversation between a monk and a dying Templar. When asked, "Are you afraid?" the knight simply replied, "No, because we do not die. We only withdraw." A statement devoid of sanctity, more like a cipher. And if it was a cipher, who was it meant for? The essence of a sect lies not in sermons, but in the layers only the chosen understand. When an order moves in silence, what they do matters less than what they refuse to reveal. The Templars never published a creed. They never recorded a theology. Yet what they built, preserved, and buried shared a single form, a convergence of physics and mysticism. Some modern theologians believe the Templars developed a belief system independent of Scripture, a religious blueprint based on astronomy, sacred geometry, and the idea of a shapeless center. A 19th-century carving found in Portugal shows a circle containing a five-pointed star surrounded by Latin words, veritas non clamat, sed pulsa resonat. Truth does not cry out. It echoes when struck. Who carved those words? The armored souls are gone. But the armor remains in crypts, in museums, in ancient paintings, and within each detail lie symbols undocumented. An eye, a downward-pointing hand, an engraved number. As if the armor wasn't forged merely for battle, but to carry a message never meant to be spoken aloud. Was that why they were destroyed, because their existence vibrated out of sync with the unified flow of the Church? A small crack may go unnoticed, but if placed just right, it can shake the entire foundation. There are lands that cannot be located with coordinates. Silent spaces within the human mind, where memory and belief intertwine, like mist drifting over a desert. Jerusalem, the origin of the Holy Land, was never merely a place. It is a permanent wound in history, a center without fixed point, where every faith sees itself and loses itself. In the 12th century, when the Knights Templar arrived at the Temple of Solomon, now reduced to ruins, they did not build. They dug. Ancient Arabic texts preserved by Ibn al-Qalanisi in the Damascus Chronicle recount that shadowy figures were seen digging beneath the temple at night, removing objects no one could quite discern. The locals did not interfere. They only watched as if they sensed that something was either being recovered or hidden away forever. For the first 9 years after their founding, the Templars recruited no one. They didn't expand, didn't communicate with the outside world, left no records. 9 years of complete silence. A strange span of time in history, as though time itself had stretched thin, as though reality was holding its breath. What could compel 9 men in the heart of conflict in the Holy Land, drenched in blood, to choose absolute silence? In the underground chambers beneath the temple's foundations, archaeologists later found structures inconsistent with Herodian architecture. Some tunnels led to dead ends, yet their vaulted ceilings bore spiral patterns, strikingly similar to symbols found at ancient Sumerian sites. In some areas, the stone flooring was lined with thin slabs filled with sand, not native to the Levant. A French researcher, Louis Charpentier, once described this sand as extinguished silver light. No one could explain it. An old map discovered in the Vatican library in the 18th century marks a point beneath Solomon's temple with a double triangle symbol, a language foreign to medieval cartography. The map bore no place names, no territorial borders, only light paths connecting circular points like constellations. It became known as the Map of Stillness because it did not guide movement, but sensation. Did they find something? An object, a revelation, or a blueprint of belief that transcended religion itself. A theory proposed in the early 20th century by German theologian Otto Rahn, who later vanished mysteriously in the Pyrenees, suggests the Templars discovered a lost apocalyptic text removed from the Bible. A passage describing a light sealed within stone. If it ever existed, the text was never made public. Yet numerous Templar architectural elements appear to echo this idea. Stone rings, enclosing hollow cores, bottomless wells with smooth, unchiseled walls. In Arthurian legend, there is a tale of a relic called the Grail, the Holy Grail, or a crystal vessel containing absolute truth. Some scholars argue the Grail was never a literal cup, but a form of conscious structure, a spiritual blueprint capable of being activated through precise material alignment. If so, the Templars were not treasure hunters. They were seekers of a convergence point where the physical and the sacred intersect. Gold, when mentioned in records, was often metaphorical. The Templars' material wealth, if any, was scattered across Europe. But the treasure spoken of in legend never had shape. It resembled a replica of history itself, untouchable, but ever present in the anomalies of events. In 1187, as Jerusalem fell to Saladin, the Templars retreated with nothing but chests, locked by a tri-key mechanism, each key held by a separate individual who would never meet the others. A simple technology, yet heavy with meaning. No one may hold the whole truth alone. To open the chest, 3 wills, 3 distinct faiths must agree, a condition nearly impossible in reality. Some believe the chests held maps. But what if the map didn't show directions but states of existence? Then how could it be read? Perhaps it was a map leading not to a place, but to the very idea of treasure, formless immaterial, a different configuration of perception. The Templars never defined the word sacred, but in their symbols, especially those carved into the castle of Tomar in Portugal, appears an image of an empty circle encircled by the Latin phrase non locus non forma sed mens, not a place, not a form, but a mind, a silent declaration. No preaching, no promotion, just etched into stone. When the Knights Templar vanished from Jerusalem, no bodies were found, no treasures, no legacy, only a total absence, as if they had never been there at all. Yet that absence weighed heavier than any evidence. It left a void one memory could not fill, and doubt began to multiply. An Israeli archaeologist once said in a 1993 interview, "When I entered the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, I saw nothing. But I felt something not yet meant to be known." The footage was never aired. Only an audio recording remains its ending, corrupted by strange interference, like metal scraping against stone. There are things that cannot be photographed, cannot be recorded, cannot be named. But they exist in the silver sheen of sandstone, in the sudden shift of wind beneath ancient ground, in the inexplicable chill of darkened vaults with no light. A map leading to gold, but gold not made of metal. a point of convergence with no coordinates, a silver light that doesn't shine, but quietly reflects something that has never been named. Not all power takes form. Some powers drift like incense in a cathedral, light nearly invisible, yet if breathed in deeply, they cling to every cell in the lungs and never leave. By the mid-13th century, Europe was no longer a mere map. It had become a field of tension between two silent poles, the Pope and the King. One a center of faith, the other a center of force. One a sacred flame, the other a cold blade. The Templars stood in between. They belonged to neither side, submitted to no one, opposed no one publicly, but pledged loyalty to no one fully. They were the archway suspended between two pillars, one shaped like a church, the other like a castle. They did not bear down on either, but if that arch collapsed, both sides would crack. Initially, the Vatican supported the Templars, seeing in them a force of action in the physical world where prayers alone no longer sufficed. But over time, distance grew, because the Templars did not just wield swords. They carried parchment symbols and silence. And silence placed precisely can be an accusation no one can refute. A document by Cardinal Rinaldo from 1268 notes that the Templars refused to obey the Holy See's order regarding the distribution of sacred lands. They did not declare rebellion, they simply did not answer. And it was that refusal to speak that sent a chill through the Vatican. A military, financial, and spiritual order operating in silence and beyond subjugation was something no authority could control. For monarchs, the issue was simpler. The Templars were too rich. They owned land in France, Portugal, England, even on the Armenian frontier. They lent money. They safeguarded noble estates. They had their own information network, faster and more accurate than royal envoys. They paid no taxes, bowed to no king, yet influenced every major transaction. They were Europe's unnamed bank. Philip IV of France didn't believe in omens, but he believed in account balances. When war with England pushed the crown to the brink, he turned to the Templars not to ask, but to demand. Yet no one could make demands of an order with no declared leader. No one signed. No one answered. Every chest was sealed with trust, something that could not be forced. So the siege began not with armies, but with information. Rumors spread the Templars performed strange rituals, kissed each other on the mouth, trampled the cross, worshipped a talking head. Accusations sprang up across northern France, yet no one knew who started them. Like a toxic smoke with no origin, only evidence of its slow invasion. Pope Clement V was caught in a bind. On one side, the Templars who had once helped the Church maintain control of the Crusaders. On the other, the French king who could shatter the Vatican's structure with political and military force. Clement chose a third option, silence. But within that silence, a document was penned, Pastoralis Praeminentiae, issued on November 22, 1307, authorizing the arrest of all Templar knights and the seizure of their assets. A door began to close. Yet through its final crack, strange movements occurred. A handwritten record from Languedoc by a royal clerk describes how large chests were removed from Templar monasteries just hours before the arrests. Witnesses claimed the carts were driverless, and their wheel tracks didn't match French terrain, wider and deeper, as if carrying something impossibly heavy. Where did they go? No one knows. But 2 weeks later, a Templar fleet departed from the port of La Rochelle. It was their last recorded naval movement. After that, nothing. No wreckage, no logs, no prisoners. The sea swallowed them like a secret without a ripple. From then on, a quiet question haunted secret records. If the Templars truly possessed a treasure, it could not have been of ordinary matter. Gold does not move on its own, cannot vanish in silence, and does not strike fear in both Pope and King. Only one thing can knowledge that, if revealed, would collapse the religious, political, and symbolic structure that held Europe in balance. An undeciphered manuscript, a blasphemous proof, a different origin of Scripture, all speculation. Yet one small detail unsettles every theory after the Templars were dissolved. Many of their symbols, especially the human head, the eight-pointed star, and the triangle-inscribed circle, began appearing quietly in Vatican architectural sketches. Who drew them? No one confessed, no one signed, just like before. A symbologist once wrote, "When a symbol moves without leaving a trace, it ceases to be a symbol. It becomes a crack in consciousness." The Templars left behind no legacy. They left behind a specific kind of absence, an absence with shape. And that shape, though nameless, remains etched into the wall between crown and power. One power wears a crown, another wears the triple tiara. But the Templars wore nothing. Only a white circle on the chest crossed in blood red. A circle that did not glow, but pulled the eye. As if it did not reflect power, it consumed it. There are days in history that never pass. They are not repeated, not taught, not commemorated through ritual, yet they persist like an underground layer in collective memory. Friday, October 13th, on 1307, was one such day. There was no great war, no natural disaster, no rewriting of Scripture. Only an emptiness spreading slowly like blood seeping beneath white cloth. At dawn that morning, orders were carried out simultaneously across the Kingdom of France. Over 2,000 Knights Templar were arrested in utter silence. No resistance, no cries for help. The warriors once called divine, who had held Jerusalem through fire and war, now bowed their heads and walked into imprisonment as if they had foreseen this moment long ago. In Paris, Grand Master Jacques de Molay was arrested alongside his deputy Geoffrey de Charnay. They were dragged from the stone chapel where secret rites had once been performed and imprisoned in the Temple Tower, a place that once belonged to them. It was not merely physical confinement. It was a redefinition of reality, when the keeper of the key is locked inside the very room he built. Inquisition records from the time speak with the echo of strange dreams, worshipping a skull imbued with life, desecrating the cross, engaging in impure initiation rites. None of it was proven, yet none of it was categorically denied. In most testimonies, the Templars simply said, "We are not permitted to reveal." No denials, no defense, no justification, just a hollow negation leading nowhere. But it was precisely this hollow echo, repeated like a reversed prayer, that unsettled the Holy See. If the charges were false, why did they not fight back? If true, why did no one try to save themselves? There were no answers. Only wounds quietly soaking into the stone floors of prison cells. A clerk's report from Paris noted, "When light entered Jacques de Molay's cell, his eyes did not react, as though he had already seen a different light deeper long ago." That report was never officially published. It belonged to a bundle of documents lost for nearly 4 centuries, rediscovered in 1953 in the Vatican's archives. The scholar who found it later disappeared while studying Templar manuscripts in Almeria, Spain. His name was never mentioned again, as if erased from the living. That Friday, rumors spread of strange occurrences in abandoned Templar chapels, candles extinguishing on their own, darkness neither spreading nor retreating. A suspended state. A whisper heard by all, yet repeated by none. The legend of Friday the 13th being cursed begins with this moment. But what's terrifying isn't the superstition, it's the convergence of myth and history. When collective fear takes root in a real event, it ceases to be folklore. It becomes instinct. A fracture in the subconscious passed down like a cold, shapeless smoke. In the years that followed, interrogations continued, but no confessions broke the surface. No one revealed a treasure. No one mapped a secret. No doctrinal structure was offered that could aid the church or the crown. Only illusions, symbols, and a silence as solid as stone. By 1312, under pressure from Philip IV, Pope Clement V issued Vox in Excelso, formally dissolving the Templar order. Not for proven crimes, but because the accusations had damaged the image of the church. An undefined reason. As if the very existence of the Templars was an accusation no one could rebut. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay was burned alive on a small island in the Seine. A witness recorded that he did not scream. He simply gazed at Notre Dame, not in anger, but with a final recognition the place that once blessed him now watched him turn to ash. The flames did not flicker. The wind did not shift. But something vanished from that space, a connection between earth and sky, severed not by blade, but by silence. Later that same year, both Philip IV and Clement V died. The deaths of the two most powerful men in Europe arrived without drama. No assassinations, no long illnesses, just cessation. Some ancient sources claim it was Jacques de Molay's curse cast from uncooled ashes. But perhaps it was not a curse. Perhaps it was the inevitable consequence of touching what must not be named. In the aftermath, organizations bearing Templar echoes began to appear: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, secret orders with ritual structure, abstract symbols, encrypted language. No one claims to be the Templars' true heirs. Yet in their rites, the red cross, the white circle, the skull, and the fire return, recur, like a message with no sender. That Friday never came again. But it didn't need to, because it never left. It lies within the spiritual strata of Europe, in every unnamed dream, in the sudden chill upon seeing a symbol you recognize, yet cannot place. A day that does not repeat, but still exists, like a spear that pierced no one, yet made history bleed. In the shadowed depths beneath Paris, the dungeons did not echo. Stone swallowed sound the way night swallows flame. And it was there, beneath the surface, beneath memory, beneath the framework of sanctioned history, that the slow death of a silence began. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, waited. Not in fear, not in hope. He waited the way a sealed vault waits beneath the sea, pressured heavy unmoving. For 7 years he remained imprisoned. 7 years of interrogations without questions, trials without verdicts, days measured not in sunlight, but in the absence of change. The accusations against him were as spectral as the air he breathed: worship of a talking head, denials of Christ's secret rites in candlelight. They were not evidence. They were suggestions sharpened into blades. Confessions were extracted not to reveal truth, but to forge a structure of guilt, upon which power could reassert itself. He recanted, then unrecanted, then said nothing. And perhaps that was the most dangerous act of all. Silence, when held for long enough, doesn't simply resist, it begins to reshape the shape of knowing. In that silence, things grow suspicion, myth, fear, and sometimes something else, something less easy to name. Not knowledge, but a shadow in the outline where knowledge ought to be. The year was 1314. The day was fading. The crowd gathered not for justice, but for closure, though no one could say what precisely was being closed. There were no screams, no chaos, just the rhythmic crackling of wood beneath a body tied to a stake. The Seine flowed nearby, silent and blind. Some say the flames moved too slow, that the wind did not rise, that even the smoke seemed unsure whether to rise or collapse back into the earth. Mole's last words, recorded in fragments, were less curse than echo. Not a prophecy, not a plea. Only the truth. We will meet in the dark. What truth, whose dark? The words offered no foothold, and perhaps that too was intentional. 2 monarchs died soon after Pope Clement V and King Philip IV. Their deaths were natural only by technicality. One fell ill without cause. The other perished in a riding accident no one witnessed. No heir endured. No legacy followed without fracture. A coincidence, historians say, but coincidence has its own gravity when tethered to silence. In the centuries that followed, no sovereign reclaimed what had been lost. The Templars' lands were divided, but never truly claimed. The documents were burned, yet their memory persisted. The vaults were emptied, but no one saw what had been inside. The flame consumed the body, but not the shape of the body in the minds of those who watched it vanish. Records exist of a letter sent from Avignon to the court of Portugal months before Mole's execution, describing the Pope's great unrest in dreams. The letter has no return address. Its seal is unrecognized. The ink, when tested centuries later, contains traces of rare minerals not found in Europe. The letter mentions a structure inside time and the name that reverses the cross. No one has been able to interpret either phrase. The stake upon which Mole burned was dismantled the next day. The ashes were thrown into the river, but the scaffold's base, the part sunken into the cobblestone, was left behind. And over it nothing grew. No moss, no vine, no trace of rot. Even in the humid Parisian spring, that square of ground remained sterile. The area was eventually paved over. But some say during certain dusks the air shifts there. Not colder, not warmer, just thinner. It was never officially acknowledged, but a private correspondence among Benedictine scholars in the mid-1400s described a residue of absence that remained in the documents related to the Templars. Not gaps, not redactions, but a kind of conceptual void, as if certain sentences, even when read aloud, produced no auditory recognition. A linguistic silence. A phrase that refused to resonate. One monk described the experience of copying these texts. The ink resists the parchment. The words resist the tongue. I write, but the shape of what is written falls backward into itself. What does it mean when writing refuses to remain written? The execution of Jacques de Molay was not the end of the Templars. It was the beginning of their absence, a structured absence, a carefully arranged vacuum that rather than disappear began to exert influence. The way a missing piece can define the meaning of the whole. After that day, symbols began to move. A red cross surfaced in carved beams of Scottish cathedrals, where no Templars were ever known to live. A certain geometric proportion, 7 by 22, emerged in architectural plans from Portugal to Malta. Seals bearing closed eyes and upward-pointing keys began to appear in private codices, not as relics but as sigils still active, still referencing something. Not memory, not identity, but continuation. And yet when modern scholars search for the lines connecting these occurrences, they find not a web, but a tunnel. Not expansion, but depth. Everything points downward, as if the order never spread but sank. Not a network, but a descent. Into what? A manuscript found in a monastery outside Toledo contains only one line written over and over again. We are not gone. We are inverted. The ink fades differently across the repetitions. Some lines almost vanish. Others grow darker with age. The phrase is not explained. The fire in the dungeon was meant to cauterize history, to end not just a life, but a possibility. Yet what remains of that fire is not ash, but aperture, a hole, a question, a gap in the timeline of certainty. We teach that the order was disbanded, that its wealth was seized, that its final leader died without successor. But each of those statements relies on verbs was died seized that presuppose an ending. And endings, as history too often shows, are less reliable than they appear, especially when they are this quiet. Perhaps the true execution did not happen on the island that day. Perhaps it happened in thought, in the way we arrange ideas. Define blasphemy, draw the line between sacred and profane. Perhaps what was burned was not a man, but a bridge. A way of looking that could never again be approached without danger. Not because it is false, but because it cannot be named without also naming what we have chosen to forget. And so the fire continues not in flame, but in stillness, in the places we do not look, in the names we no longer say, in the questions we are taught not to ask. Not all vanishings begin with smoke. Some begin with preparation, with quiet wheels turning, with chests locked days before keys passed without words, and orders given through gestures rather than ink. Disappearance, when orchestrated carefully enough, ceases to be retreat. It becomes design. And in the port of La Rochelle, on the western edge of France, something designed stepped beyond history. It was October 1307, the same month the arrests began, the same season the net closed. But even before the first door was kicked open, the ships had already moved. 13 vessels, flagless, not registered under any noble house, with no banners, no crests, no markings, only the silent language of purpose. They left port in the early morning unaccompanied by guards or escort heading west into the Atlantic, into a direction not mapped and not recorded. La Rochelle had been the Templars' stronghold by sea, a harbor fortified not just with walls, but with intention. The docks were arranged in such a way that visibility from land was obstructed angles carefully chosen to obscure the loading process. Beneath the surface, stone vaults lined with metal struts held goods that never passed through customs. Not gold, not weapons, but scrolls, objects bound in cloth, sealed urns, crates so heavy that 6 men struggled to lift one. No records survive of the fleet's destination, no surviving manifest, no logs recovered. Only the reports of townspeople who said they saw shadows on the tide, and one boy who later claimed he dreamed of ships with no sails, moving like they were being pulled by breath. Some say they sailed to Scotland, others to Portugal. Some whisper of Nova Scotia long before that name ever existed. But each theory assumes something the event itself refuses to confirm, that there was a destination, that the disappearance was from one place to another. But what if it was only departure? What if the act of vanishing was the point? Centuries later, when the Portuguese Order of Christ emerged, absorbing many of the Templars' surviving properties, its seal bore uncanny resemblance to the Templar cross. Its structure, too, echoed the old order vows of secrecy, a hierarchy wrapped in symbols, an obsession with navigation. Prince Henry the Navigator, patron of this order, never publicly acknowledged any link to the Templars, but maps recovered from his archives contain lines of latitude, matching the patterns once carved into Templar floor mosaics in Tamar. A coincidence, perhaps, but the same navigational lines appear again in a completely different location beneath layers of plaster in the chapel of Rosslyn, Scotland. Not carved into the stone, but painted, then hidden. A faint grid of intersecting arcs and nodes forming no readable map, yet resembling the star charts of ancient Chaldea. Some researchers believe these marks predate the chapel itself, that they were inherited. By whom? By the ones who disappeared. The Templars did not need to survive publicly. Their power had never been in visibility. It had always lived in corridors and vaults in the precision of silence. Their fleet's departure then was not escape. It was redistribution, a shattering of the whole into fragments scattered across the compass. To find one piece would mean nothing. The meaning was in the structure, the way absence connected itself. One chronicler from Lubeck, writing nearly a century later, described a white-cloaked figure arriving in the port city bearing scrolls wrapped in leather. He never spoke, but traded the scrolls for passage north. The captain of the vessel later told a monk that one of the scrolls was filled with diagrams, none of which matched any known language or measure. Not astronomy, not geometry, just shapes within shapes within shapes. And in each corner a symbol of wind. The sea for the Templars had always been more than a route. It was memory in motion. It swallowed traces. It refused to be gridded. And above all, it layered movement upon movement until nothing could be isolated from the whole. What began in Jerusalem had not ended in Paris. It had simply been submerged. Modern oceanographers analyzing the Atlantic trade winds and medieval sailing routes determined that a fleet leaving La Rochelle that autumn could have reached the Azores within 3 weeks. From there, it could have continued westward, following currents now well known to navigators, but then barely suspected. A ghost fleet ahead of its time, outrunning the calendar. But even these projections miss something crucial. The fleet left before the order fell. They were not running. They were enacting. A document discovered in a hidden wall compartment at a former Templar commandery in Cyprus, unpublished, untranslated for centuries, contains a single line written in medieval Latin, non portamus aurum. Portamus partem mundi quae refugit nomen. We carry not gold, but the part of the world that flees naming. What part of the world flees naming? Not territory, not wealth, not relics. Only ideas, ideas that cannot be possessed, only preserved. What if the fleet was not meant to deliver something, but to dissolve it into the sea, to let it ride the currents forever disassembled, immune to seizure? What if the real purpose was not to hide the treasure, but to scatter it across space and time, broken into gestures, into ruins, into unreadable texts and misplaced architectures? Even today, in certain coastal towns of Galicia, old fishing families pass down stories of the ones in white, who came before the Christians who spoke little and built stone towers with inner chambers no one dared open. The towers were all dismantled in the 18th century. What was inside was never recorded. But one slab survives, stored in a private collection. On it, a cross, 8-pointed. Not Templar, not Maltese. Something else. Something in between? In that space between known symbols lies the shape of a departure that still echoes. We speak of disappearance as if it were absence. But disappearance, when constructed with precision, is not the opposite of presence, it is its mirror. A way of remaining without being seen. A method of movement that renders location irrelevant. The fleet did not vanish. It unspoke itself. Blood doesn't vanish. It diverts. It reroutes like an underground stream, hidden but persistent. When the order of the Knights Templar collapsed under fire and forged confession, not all of it turned to ash. The robes burned, the symbols were erased, the names were outlawed, but something deeper, thicker endured. Not just belief, not just memory, something biological, something inherited. There were whispers that the lineage did not die with the flames of Paris, that it spread veiled and diluted, but never extinguished. Historians speak in terms of dissolution and exile. But the more precise word might be diffusion. After the arrests in France, dozens of Templar knights fled, not with armies, not with banners, but with silence. Scotland, then at odds with the papacy, due to Robert the Bruce's excommunication, became an unlikely refuge. The Templars found shelter not through politics, but through absence of allegiance. In a land where papal authority held no weight, the hunted could become the invisible. At Bannockburn in 1314, mere months after Jacques de Molay's execution, the Scots delivered a shocking defeat to the English. Chroniclers mention an unexpected cavalry charge that broke the enemy line, a mounted force in unfamiliar formation, wearing no recognizable colors. Some dismissed the account as myth, others saw it as anomaly. But to those who traced patterns in the fog, it was not anomaly, it was residue. If remnants of the Templars truly fought at Bannockburn, they did so not to win land or glory. They did so to repay refuge with presence. And then, as always, to recede. The Scottish link was never officially documented, but certain families in the Highlands retained seals with unmistakable symbols, crosses not of St. Andrew, but of equal-armed red. Their tombs bore no names, only glyphs, some shaped like compasses, others like open eyes. One tomb, uncovered in the 1700s, contained a sword wrapped not in cloth, but in a page from a missal. The Latin ink, still legible hoc non est corpus, said via, "This is not a body, but a path." Meanwhile, further south and west, Portugal became more than sanctuary, it became transformation. There, the Order of Christ was established in 1319, a reconstitution, a veil. Pope John XXIII sanctioned it under new charters, new names, but old architecture. The same commanderies, the same rights, the same hands beneath different gloves. Prince Henry the Navigator would later become Grand Master of this new order. Under his patronage, ships set out beyond the visible world west into waters no European had charted. These expeditions were explained as trade, as expansion, as scientific curiosity. But in the private records kept at the monastery of Tomar, there are references to something else. Not routes, not cargo. Coordinates, a set of numbers repeated in multiple logs, not aligning with any coastal markers. Always preceded by the same phrase, locum fractum, the broken place. And always followed by one Latin word, sanguis, blood. What kind of blood could a voyage seek? Genealogists have for centuries speculated about a secret Templar bloodline, a lineage thought to descend not from nobility, but from something older. Some point toward the Merovingians, others toward esoteric claims of descendants of Christ, of hidden unions of blood that bore not just history, but alternative authorship of history itself. The Church declared these theories heretical. Yet they persisted not in the mouths of rebels, but in the margins of books. Not proclaimed, but insinuated, and sometimes encoded. In a small chapel outside Porto, frescoes were discovered in 1891 beneath centuries of plaster. Among them a woman veiled in blue holding not a child, but a scroll. Beside her a knight, one knee bent, head bowed, and in his hand a branch pierced with thorns. No scripture matched the scene. No doctrine could explain it. But carved beneath the frame were words barely decipherable, sicut flumen et tamen memor, like a river, and yet remembered. Bloodlines, when hidden, do not announce themselves. They trickle through inheritance, reshaped by marriages, lost names, lost lands. But sometimes in the fog of genealogy, a pattern surfaces. Families that, despite scattered geographies, carry the same peculiar motifs: stars with 8 points, keys, open hands, inverted towers. In the borderlands of Aragon, archival maps show certain regions referred to not by name, but by symbol. A cluster of villages, each linked by an old road no longer used. At each terminus of this road, a cross, not for worship, for orientation. A path formed by settlement, a code embedded in land. What did they carry, these refugees who became stonemasons, farmers, pilgrims? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only memory. But memory, when repeated across generations without speech, becomes something else. It becomes instinct. Modern DNA analysis has in some cases found shared markers between noble lines of Portugal and obscure families in Languedoc, once accused of heresy. Statistical anomaly or inheritance science cannot answer what it cannot ask. A question must be framed to be tested. And certain questions remain unframed not by ignorance, but by design, because to ask is to invoke. And invocation draws things into shape. The diverted bloodline, if it exists, may not run cleanly. It may not flow in single veins. But it leaves fingerprints on architecture, on ritual, on the way some names resist translation. Like mole, which in some Basque dialects resembles a term meaning to shadow the moon, or charney, which in Old Occitan approximates path through absence. Nothing proven, but patterns do not require proof to exist. They only require repetition. We do not speak of the Templars as survivors. That term implies a return, a continuity. But blood does not survive. It adapts. It moves where pressure does not reach. It folds into shape and waits, sometimes in bodies, sometimes in books, sometimes in silence. And if one listens carefully to that silence, it hums, low, patient, directionless, but never lost. There are places where stone speaks in silence, not through carvings of saints or inscriptions of dates, but through patterns, repetitions, deviations, a rhythm without music. The Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland is one of these places. It does not declare its purpose. It does not align neatly with the sacred geometry of cathedrals or the austerity of Calvinist Reformation. Instead, it whispers in symbols, in contradictions, in an architecture that seems to recall something never named. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, a noble of Norse lineage, the chapel stands on a slope overlooking a river that folds and coils like a question mark. From the outside, it resembles a fragment of a greater structure unfinished or intentionally severed. Inside, the air is heavier than the stone. Light hesitates. Sound flattens. And everywhere symbols, not Christian symbols alone. Pagan faces peer from corners. Green men sprouting foliage from mouths, 8-pointed stars, coiled dragons, angels holding objects that resemble modern instruments. A chapel caught between traditions, or perhaps a chapel built to blur them. Among the most enduring mysteries is the arrangement of carvings on the arches and columns. Over 200 unique symbols repeated in strange sequences. In 2007, a father and son, both amateur musicians, suggested that these symbols might represent musical notes. Their theory proposed a pattern-frozen sound embedded in stone. A hymn not written, but carved. They assigned pitches to the cubes, mapped the sequence, played the result. The melody was haunting, repetitive, almost incantatory. It resembled neither Gregorian chant nor folk tune. Instead, it hovered in between like the architecture itself. But the theory, while beautiful, solved nothing, because to understand Rosslyn is not to decode it. It is to sit with what cannot be translated. On the chapel's apprentice pillar, a twisted column unlike any other in the building, there are vines spiraling upward in unnatural symmetry. Legend says the builder's apprentice carved it while the master was away. Upon the master's return, seeing it complete and superior, he killed the boy out of envy. His face twisted in stone is carved into the opposite wall, condemned to gaze upon the pillar forever. But the tale doesn't explain the symbols at its base. They're a sequence of tiny repeating glyphs, not runes, not Latin, not any known alphabet. They resemble nothing and yet feel intentional. Attempts to match them to existing cipher systems, Caesar Visionaire, even Enochian, fail. Too many inconsistencies, too much order. One linguist who spent 2 decades cataloging them remarked, "This isn't a language, it's a logic. A structure that suggests meaning not through syntax, but through spatial rhythm." It is not the only anomaly. Beneath the chapel sealed by stone and time lies a crypt. Officially, it remains inaccessible. The Sinclair family denies that it has ever been opened. Yet infrared surveys in 2011 revealed hollows beneath the floor inconsistent with the known foundation. One cavity measures exactly 22 feet long and 6 feet wide, shaped less like a tomb and more like a vessel. No excavation has been allowed. The walls above the sealed chamber bear carvings of boats. Not ships of the North Sea, but long, narrow vessels more Mediterranean in style. Alongside them, stars, some accurately placed according to precession models from the 12th century. Others out of alignment, as if referencing a sky not of this earth. Templar symbols are visible but never dominant. The red cross, the equal-armed sunburst. But more unsettling are the spaces between, areas where stone has been smoothed unnaturally, as though something had once been etched there and then erased not by time, but by choice. A local legend claims that a scroll rests beneath the chapel, wrapped in oilskin, sealed in glass, a record from a ship that never docked, written in a language that begins at the center of the page and spirals outward like the vines on the pillar. No one has seen this scroll. No one will say who told the tale. But children in the village still repeat the rhyme. In Roslyn deep the red cross sleeps, below the stone where no wind weeps, a tongue that loops a voice that waits behind the door that has no gate. The voice that waits. Templar historians often focus on the visible, the documents, the weapons, the alliances. But the deeper current of their legacy lies in what they left without explanation. And Roslyn is perhaps the most articulate example of this, a speechless relic. It does not prove anything. It only insists by existing. Why here? Why would a Scottish noble build a chapel that encodes not just biblical allegory, but patterns reminiscent of Solomonic tradition, Norse myth and Eastern numerology, unless he inherited something more than land? Unless the chapel was not his creation, but his responsibility, a stewardship of form, a code written not to be read, but to be preserved until reading becomes possible. This idea that knowledge can exist beyond comprehension, waiting not for interpretation, but for alignment, is older than Roslyn. It runs through alchemical manuscripts, through the construction of labyrinths, through chants that repeat syllables long after meaning decays. What Roslyn represents may not be a repository of treasure or doctrine, but a frequency, a signal in stone, coded not in words but in spatial resonance. Its geometry, its acoustics, its unspoken grammar, each component calibrated like a lock awaiting the right vibration. And if that lock opens, no prophecy speaks of it. No apocalypse is tied to its secrets. But perhaps that's the most unnerving possibility, that the truth it holds is not dramatic, but destabilizing. Not an answer, but a question rephrased so precisely it unravels certainty. The chapel does not ask you to believe. It only invites you to notice that something watches from the stone, and that the script, though silent, has not gone cold. In every cathedral there is a still point, a quiet gravity behind the gilded arches and vaulted ceilings, a place where the architecture stops speaking and begins listening. For centuries beneath these altars, beneath the rows of carved saints and chalices, encrusted in symbolism, something deeper was kept. Not always visible, not always named, but present. And beneath some of these altars, especially in the oldest churches touched by Templar hands, that presence took form in iron. An iron hand, to be precise. Not life-sized, not ceremonial, but forged and deliberate, clenched into a gesture that doesn't bless, doesn't strike, but simply holds. It was discovered in 1857 beneath the floor of a collapsed chapel near Carcassonne. The church had not been in use since the 14th century. When the altar stone was lifted, a small cavity was found dry, intentionally sealed. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, was a sculpted hand. Rough, too dense for ritual, no markings, just a weight. The object was removed, catalogued, and forgotten in a museum archive for nearly 100 years before anyone asked why was it placed there. Templar artifacts are rare, verified ones rarer still. But this hand bore details that matched drawings found in marginalia from the late 1200s, sketches of a similar shape annotated in Latin with a phrase that does not translate easily. Manus quo non tangit sed tenet. The hand that does not touch but holds. What does it hold? That is the question the church never answered. In 1974, a theologian named Father Armand Lefebvre published a quiet paper circulated among a restricted academic circle. In it, he suggested that the Templars possessed a doctrine not of blasphemy, but of containment. That the real heresy was not what they believed, but what they tried to keep hidden from belief altogether. According to Lefebvre, the Templars may have discovered or constructed an idea so fundamentally destabilizing to both monarchy and ecclesia that their entire system became about protecting it from articulation. An anti-revelation. A silence that needed to be guarded not out of reverence, but because once spoken, it would unravel the grammar of the world. The iron hand, he claimed, was symbolic of that containment, a gesture of arrested knowledge, not a fist of rebellion, but a grip of preservation. A reminder some truths cannot be freed without consequence. The Church never responded to Lefebvre's theory, but others noticed, following the publication, a surge of interest surrounded sealed chapels in southern France, particularly those connected to Cathar and Templar activity. In several beneath the altar, stone's iron fragments were found, never shaped identically, never explained. In one case in Béziers, the remains of an iron crown were unearthed, its interior lined not with jewels, but with mirror-polished glass facing inward. A crown that reflects only the mind of the one who wears it. A crown not meant for display, but for internal vision. If these items were Templar, they belonged to a language of objects unlike the relic-focused spirituality of the mainstream church. Not fragments of saints, not pieces of the cross. These were not instruments of veneration, but instruments of containment, perhaps even counterweight. The Church of the medieval period believed in presence through object. The Eucharist, the relic, the altar stone. But the Templars, if these findings suggest anything, believed in presence through silence, through form that does not explain itself. Why would the Church hide this? Because in a system built on revelation, on the unveiling of truth through divine order, the existence of a truth that must not be spoken is a contradiction that breaks the engine. It suggests there is knowledge outside the reach of canon. It suggests that something older or deeper or simply ungovernable sits beneath the theological architecture. And perhaps the Templars found it. Or perhaps they made it up to control those who feared unknowing. Either possibility was dangerous. Records from the Inquisition show an unusual pattern in the testimonies of captured Templars. When asked about their initiation rituals, many described being shown an object, but they were forbidden to name it. Only one testimony dared say more. It came from a knight in Normandy who broke during torture. He said, "They showed me the hand. They said it holds the word that breaks the world. The transcript ends there. No follow-up, no elaboration." The phrase has echoed ever since in fringe theology and occult speculation, the word that breaks the world. Not a weapon, not a prophecy, a word. And if that word is real, it is not one that destroys matter, it is one that destroys structure. That makes what we call truth begin to fold. The Templars in this reading become less an order of warriors and more an order of curators, guardians of a rupture, not defenders of belief, but of boundaries, keeping something in or keeping something out. One can only wonder, was the iron hand a lock, a signal, a reminder? A second object was uncovered in 1991 in northern Italy, also beneath a church with Templar associations. This time not a hand, but a jaw. Forged, not bone. Hingeless, fused shut. Across its teeth, tiny notches like barcodes, though hundreds of years too old. The object resisted all corrosion tests. The inscription on its base, verbum tectum, the veiled word. Again, no explanation. The church declined comment. And so the pattern continues beneath places built to transmit faith. These iron objects linger mute, heavy, unclaimed. Like punctuation in a sentence we're not allowed to read. What did the Templars know? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe just enough to know that some answers are not for solving, but for guarding. Some truths do not free. They fracture. And the hand beneath the altar, still clenched after centuries, has not let go. There is a difference between what we forget and what we are never allowed to remember. History pretends to be whole, but its continuity depends not on what is preserved, but on what is edited out. Like a film reel with missing frames, it plays smooth until one watches too closely. Then the jump cuts become obvious. The flicker, the silence between scenes, the rearrangement of cause and effect. What if the Templars did not merely vanish? What if they fell through one of these fractures? In the margins of official record, strange artifacts remain. Incomplete, out of place, impossible to reconcile, yet never entirely discarded. They sit in drawers beneath glass cases labeled unknown, undated, uncategorized. And across them there is a pattern, one that emerges only when viewed sideways, only when the historian stops reading chronologically and begins following the shadows instead. Start with the London Codex. Discovered in 1712 behind the false wall of a burned priory once controlled by the Templars, it contains drawings of architectural forms that defy medieval engineering. Arches that bend inward like reversed tension. Spirals collapsing into negative space. At the edge of one page, a diagram of what appears to be a sphere nested within a cube, annotated with a Latin phrase barely legible beneath scorch marks, non locus, non tempus, not a place, not a time. Most dismissed the manuscript as the fevered imagination of a monk exposed to smoke and solitude. But no one could explain the ink. It was not iron gall, not charcoal, not ochre. Chemical tests revealed trace elements of vanadium and silver nitrate in ratios unknown to 13th century Europe. No known Templar document uses such a compound. And yet it exists, carefully drawn, with hand-stabilized linework that suggests training. Elsewhere on a cliffside in Sintra, Portugal, a stone was found embedded deep within a natural fault line, clearly placed, not fallen. The stone bore carvings identical to those in Roslin, but positioned in reverse, like mirrored notation. Beneath them a groove had been worn, not by tool, but by time. Geologists estimated erosion at over 500 years, yet the symbols showed no weathering. It was as if the surface had aged, but the mark itself had not. How does something remain untouched while the world around it decays? Unless it isn't placed in time the way we assume. Templar activity in Portugal has long been documented, but most of it centers on military and naval exploits. The Order of Christ, their spiritual successor, built fortresses and launched fleets. But beneath that visible history is another, a trail of incomplete chapels never consecrated, built at angles that defy religious convention. Many aligned not to Jerusalem, but to solstice shadows. Lines drawn not in relation to the holy city, but to the sun's stillness. One such chapel in the Algarve contains a circular chamber with no entrance, only a slit at the ceiling, through which noon sunlight strikes a single black stone embedded in the floor. Beneath the stone, nothing. No tomb, no relic, no record, just a void. When light touches it, the room becomes colder. Architects cannot explain the effect. No airflow, no draft, no moisture variation, just a measurable drop in temperature, isolated and brief. The effect occurs precisely twice a year at solstice and lasts 7 minutes. Then it stops. Visitors speak of a pressure of vertigo. Some claim to hear a hum, others nothing at all. The Catholic Church has never acknowledged the chamber. It does not appear on official maps. Its custodians are secular, and no ownership papers exist. What does this have to do with the Templars? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Because if the Templars believed as some suspect not in power but in pattern, then such chambers, such anomalies are not deviations. They are markers, not messages but alignments, points along a deeper geometry. And geometry can fold. In an obscure 15th century alchemical manuscript held at the Biblioteca Marziana in Venice, there is an illustration of a knight kneeling before a gateway shaped like a vesica piscis, the intersection of two circles. Within the shape, two mirrored towers, a river flowing upward, and a Latin caption Transitio non temporalis. Transition not in time. Is this metaphor or instruction? If Templar knowledge was passed, not erased, then perhaps its ultimate secret was not a treasure, not a lineage, not a doctrine, but a map. Not one that guides through space, but one that describes interruption. A way to step outside the line, to leave history not by dying, but by ceasing to conform to its timeline. A heretical idea, certainly, but not unthinkable. Even Augustine wrote of the heavenly city as existing beyond temporal cause. Even the Book of Revelation speaks of moments outside of time. Maybe the Templars believed that holiness wasn't found in revelation, but in subtraction. Remove the context. Remove the voice. Remove the witness. What remains? A fragment, a room without a door, a stone that does not weather, an iron hand clenched not in resistance but in preservation. Modern historians resist this line of thought. Understandably, it is not falsifiable. It is not peer-reviewed. But documents remain. Symbols persist. And across Europe there are places that vibrate just slightly differently, where silence seems weighted, where time does not align with memory. Templar commanderies now house cafes and flats. Their libraries have become archives. Their churches now serve parishioners who've never heard the name Jacques de Molay. But beneath the reconstructions and restorations, the stones remain, aligned the same way, angled toward something we've chosen to forget. Not an enemy, not a god, not a truth, but a break. A crack running through history itself, barely visible, until the light hits it just right. It begins as many things do with a rumor, a box, not large, not ornate. Wood darkened with age, iron bands curled tightly around its corners like clenched hands. No inscription, no hinges, no visible lock. A chest said to belong to the Knights Templar discovered in 1608, deep within a walled crypt beneath a former commandery in Aragon. And it has never been opened, not because it cannot be forced. It could by now have been shattered with modern tools, x-rayed, dissected, reduced to splinters and guesses. But it has not. Every time the chest resurfaces at auctions in museums or in obscure private collections, it is accompanied by the same condition: do not open. Not out of superstition, but of instruction. Inside, it is said, lies either nothing or everything. The earliest known mention of the chest appears in a letter dated 1611, written by a Jesuit scholar named Brother Hernando del Oro. He had examined the object in person briefly before it was transferred to the custody of the local bishop. In his letter, he described it not with reverence but with caution. The chest resists description not by its complexity but by its refusal to present any mystery at all. It is blank, impossibly so, and therein lies its unease. He claimed the wood did not match any native species of the region. Tests centuries later could not place its origin. Some speculated African blackwood, others something now extinct. The iron bands contained trace amounts of tellurium, a metalloid unknown to medieval Europe. But all of this can be rationalized. What cannot be explained is the weight. For an object its size, the chest weighs far too much. Not immovable, but disproportionate. An oppressive density, as though it holds not matter, but gravity. Those who've lifted it describe an odd sensation not merely of resistance, but of being watched. Photographs of the chest are rare, not by prohibition, but by failure. For reasons unknown, exposures come back blurred light splays across the frame unpredictably, even digital renders appear warped. The grain of the wood seems to change with angle. In some shots, the iron appears rusted, in others polished black. There is no visual consistency. In 1937, an academic from Vienna named Otto Krell attempted to analyze the chest in depth. He spent weeks in isolation with it, keeping meticulous notes. His final entry reads, "The box is not closed, it is waiting. He died 2 days later. Heart failure. No history of illness. His notes confiscated by authorities during wartime were never recovered. So what is in the chest? Theories range from the banal to the unhinged. Some say it's a repository for lost Templar documents, secrets about the true nature of Christ, of bloodlines of suppressed gospels. Others believe it holds objects deemed too dangerous to exist relics from the Temple of Solomon ancient technology instruments, not of this world. Still others suggest it holds only a single sheet of paper, blank on both sides, written in ink that reveals itself only when one understands what cannot be read. But the most unsettling theory is this, that the chest is empty. Not in the sense of lacking content, but in the sense of being content itself. That it contains emptiness of a particular kind. A vacuum. A concept sealed away not for preservation, but for protection. That opening it would not unleash a curse or a monster, but something worse, a redefinition. The Templars were not collectors. They were curators. They did not seek knowledge to expand it. They sought to guard the shape of the unknowable. To make sure certain ideas once glimpsed could not fully enter the world. If the chest is theirs, then it is not a vessel. It is a threshold, an object placed in time not for its own sake but to wait for hours to change. A report in the 1980s from a Swiss foundation, never made public, only circulated among a handful of historians, claimed the chest had been subjected to spectrographic scanning. The results were inconclusive, but the scan revealed an interior chamber inconsistent with standard box dimensions, a spiral or at least a curve, not empty space, not solid either, something in between, something undefined. No further tests were permitted. The chest was quietly returned to a private collection where it remains. Why does it matter? Because in every age, the chest returns. It surfaces in the margins listed in estate inventories, glimpsed in grainy footage, referenced in letters that end abruptly. Its presence is not linear. It is migratory, unmoored from geography. It follows no path except the pattern of inquiry itself. Those who seek it out do not find answers. They find themselves slowed. Lives detour. Projects unravel. Thoughts shift subtly, inexplicably. A German archivist once said it does not reveal itself. It edits you. Perhaps that is the point, that the chest exists not to be opened, but to be considered. That its power is not in what it contains, but in what it interrupts. The Templars may have built it not to preserve knowledge, but to shape the contour of what must remain unknowable, a container not of things, but of limits. What does it mean to carry a question for 7 centuries? What changes in a world that circles an unopened truth, generation after generation, unable to forget something it never truly knew? There are blueprints in history, moments when something was meant to be erased but was only sealed, events not fully buried, only folded. The chest is one of them. It does not ask to be opened. It only waits for the one who cannot help but try. And perhaps when that moment comes, the box will not break. But the world around it might. History is built on paper. Kingdoms rose and fell on decrees, charters, treaties, lines drawn with ink and legitimized with seals. But not all papers remain. Some are burned, some lost to time, some vanish under more deliberate circumstances. And in the case of the Templars, certain documents didn't merely disappear, they were erased with a precision that suggests something deeper than negligence. It suggests intention. A blade not against the flesh, but across the parchment. In 2001, the Vatican publicly acknowledged the existence of a long-suppressed document, the Chinon parchment. Found misfiled in the secret archives, it revealed that in 1308, Pope Clement V had quietly absolved the Templar leadership of heresy after a secret trial. They had confessed under duress. The Church officially knew they were not guilty. And yet, less than 6 years later, they were burned. Why? Why absolve them, then permit their annihilation? Why hide the absolution for nearly 700 years? The Chinon parchment was not lost in the physical sense. It had been labeled incorrectly, filed under an irrelevant classification. But scholars who examined it noticed more. One edge of the parchment had been sliced clean, not torn, as if someone had cut away an annotation. A signature, a location. No one knows. But the cut is deliberate. A silence made physical. Other absences are harder to catalog because they are gaps not in documents, but in sequences. The Inquisition archives in Paris, for example, maintain trial records in nearly unbroken form, from 1307 to 1314. But within the volumes, pages related to the interrogation of Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, are gone. Not missing, not damaged, simply absent. The numbering skips, the ink flow shifts, the script realigns, as if the scribe mid-document had been instructed to jump forward. No reason is given. What was removed? De Charnay was one of the last to die beside Jacques de Molay, and some sources claim he spoke before the fire took him not to curse the king or pope, but to reference something called la parole scellée, the sealed word. That phrase appears nowhere else in the trial records, but it recurs in the letters of a Dominican monk named Etienne de Beaufort, who served as an inquisitor's assistant and later vanished during a pilgrimage to Galicia. In one of his surviving writings, he notes cryptically, "The word is not lost, only hidden in time, like a blade kept in paper." A metaphor, perhaps. But in the context of Templar suppression, the metaphor cuts both ways. If something had to be excised, not burned publicly but surgically removed, then it must have threatened more than authority. It must have threatened the structure of narrative itself. In 1879, during a renovation of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, workers discovered a compartment behind a shelving unit, sealed with iron brackets, inside a bundle of mold-damaged scrolls. Most were illegible. One, however, contained partial Latin text that referenced Ordo Duplicis Faciae, the Order of Two Faces. The handwriting matched that of Guillaume de Nogaret, King Philip IV's chief legal advisor and the architect behind the campaign to destroy the Templars. But Nogaret was not a priest, not a soldier, not a historian. He was a lawyer. For him to mention an order never recorded anywhere else in official proceedings suggests a private taxonomy, an internal understanding separate from what was fed to the public. Was the Order of Two Faces a name for the Templars, or a reference to something nested within them? Another group, another layer. That scroll too is now gone. Lost during World War II, presumed destroyed. But copies of the phrasing remain in the notes of a librarian named Jules Moreau, who transcribed parts of it by hand before the war. Moreau died under unknown circumstances in 1943. His notes were found decades later among unsorted papers. No family, no records. His final scribble on the back of a grocery list. The parchment bleeds when sliced. Some truths are hidden in the cut. We think of censorship as blotting. But the most powerful erasure is absence that leaves no trace. A page never printed, a name never spoken, a paragraph excised so completely that even its shadow is removed from the margin. Yet the mind detects it the way one hears a skipped beat in music or senses the missing rung in a staircase. When the French royal archivist compiled the final list of confiscated Templar properties, he numbered each estate and attached a corresponding seal. The list runs without break except for entry 147, marked only with a dash, and the phrase a determiner, to be determined. No location, no description, no seal. To this day, historians have not identified what was meant by that entry. Some suggest it was a placeholder, others an error. But in archival practice of that era, dashes were rare, and the use of a determiner implies not loss, but withholding, a conscious decision not to name. Which brings us to the final thread. In 1972, a private collector in Belgium obtained a bundle of 14th century letters at auction, among them a single page with no signature, no date, only 4 lines of Latin in tiny script. Hoc est scriptum non ut memoria fiat, sed ne oblivio vincat. Veritas non retinetur in verbis, sed in interstitis eorum. This is written not to be remembered, but so forgetting does not win. Truth is not held in words, but in the spaces between them. The letter was stolen 2 years later, never recovered. What remains is a photograph. Grainy, faint. But the lines persist, black ink resisting time. The story of the Templars is often told through what they built, castles, fortresses, commanderies. But perhaps the greater story lies in what was taken apart, in what was carefully removed, not burned, not lost, but pulled quietly from the structure of knowing, like a blade drawn across parchment, not to destroy the page, but to cut a path through the record, so no one could follow. Names are anchors. They tether presence to memory, identity, to language. In Scripture, names carry weight, not just of individuals, but of meanings. Adam meaning earth, Mary meaning bitterness or beloved. Each name becomes a vessel. And yet some vessels are sealed. Some names exist in the gaps between verses hinted at, but never spoken aloud. Among the oldest whispers surrounding the Templars is the suggestion that they guarded not just relics, not just knowledge, but a name. A single name tied not to legend, but to blood. Not metaphorical blood, not the symbolic blood of the Eucharist, but blood that ran through veins traceable living human. The claim is not new. It predates the modern imagination of conspiracy. As early as the 12th century, there were rumors that certain members of the order were more than soldiers of faith, they were protectors of a line, a bloodline, one that reached backward beyond Europe, beyond Rome, beyond even the early church. Back to a figure not canonized, not sanctified, but present nonetheless. A woman named in fragments, in patterns, in omission. Mary Magdalene, not as prostitute, not as disciple, but as wife, as mother, a heretical suggestion even now. But if taken seriously, even only as a lens, a possibility, it alters everything. The Gospels do not confirm such a role, but neither do they explicitly deny it. She appears first as witness, then as mourner, then disappears. No death recorded, no grave, no relics, only echoes. And for those who listen between the words, that absence hums with possibility. Some Gnostic texts, particularly the Gospel of Philip, make bolder claims. That she was the companion of the Savior, that he loved her more than all the disciples, that he often kissed her on the mouth. The Church declared these apocryphal fabrications, but even rejection implies threat. One does not erase the irrelevant. So what does this have to do with the Templars? In a Templar chapel in the Languedoc region of France, now in ruins, there once stood a stained glass window of unusual composition. It did not depict Christ, nor the cross, nor any saint recognized by Rome. Instead, it showed a woman in red standing at the center of a labyrinth. Around her 12 empty circles. No names, no halos, only absence. That window was destroyed during the wars of religion, but before it shattered, it was sketched by a visiting monk. His notes survive. Beneath the drawing he wrote only Mater Silenti, Mother of Silence, a title not found in liturgy, but one that suggests lineage, not metaphor. Blood. In nearby Rennes-le-Château, a 19th century priest named Béranger Saunière inexplicably gained access to sudden wealth after a renovation of his church. He never explained the source, but what he left behind was stranger than gold-altered stations of the cross-coded inscriptions and a dedication plaque honoring Marie Madeleine in language inconsistent with Catholic doctrine. He too is said to have discovered something. A document. A genealogy. Whatever it was, it died with him. But the pattern endures. When the Templars were arrested in 1307, some of the accusations were strangely specific. That they denied the divinity of Christ, that they spat on the cross, that they elevated a head in their rituals. Scholars debate the meanings. Was it blasphemy, a test of obedience? But what if it was something else entirely, an acknowledgement of a human Christ, one whose blood continued not in wine, but in womb? If such a lineage existed, it would threaten not just dogma, it would rupture it. For centuries, the Church's authority rested on the miraculous virgin birth-resurrection divinity. A bloodline would reduce the holy to the historical, would transform mystery into biology. And in that transformation, faith loses not just its power, but its necessity. The Templars, if they guarded this truth, did not write it down. No book survives, no scroll, no open claim, only hints embedded in architecture and iconography and geography. The Rosslyn Chapel again returns to this theme. Among its carvings is an image of two figures holding a banner between them. Not a cross, not a sword, a rose. Beneath it, no Latin, but a single rune traced to early Norse dialects, a symbol meaning both womb and origin. Coincidence? Perhaps. But roses appear repeatedly in Templar-adjacent iconography, not as decoration but as encryption. The rose closed was a secret. The rose open was revelation. In cryptology, this is known the best way to hide something is not behind locks, but in plain sight, in ritual, in repetition. In the symbols, we stop questioning because they feel familiar. And in these familiar forms, a name continues to ripple, never spoken, never written, but always implied. A name that, if tied to blood, would create a second Genesis, not one of clay, but of continuation. There are medieval poems, unsigned, unattributed, that refer to the bride left in Galilee. Not dead, not abandoned, left, carried away, shielded. These verses are not canon, but they survive in folk song, in whispered ballads from southern France, northern Spain, and always the same theme: a woman who waits not for salvation, but for silence to lift. So what if the Templars were guardians not of gold, but of genealogy, not of relics, but of record, a single name preserved not in ink, but in flesh, moved generation by generation through arranged marriages, through obscured adoptions, hidden in plain sight among noble lines disguised as nothing more than heritage. And perhaps if you knew the signs, the rose, the cross, the grail-shaped arch, you could trace the path, not in archives, but in blood. But what would it mean to find her name? Not a person, not a place, a concept, a continuity, a fracture in the narrative that says divinity was once and never again. A contradiction that says the sacred does not end in death but begins in birth. If such a name exists, it has never been spoken aloud in public, but some say it echoes in the silence before thunder, in the pause before questions form. In the moment you realize that belief and biology were never meant to be separate. It does not answer. It only waits beneath scripture, between the bloodlines inside the name no one dares to read aloud. There is a strange sensation when walking into a Gothic cathedral, something more than awe, more than reverence. It isn't just the height, the stained glass, the organs that seem to breathe even when silent. It's a presence, a geometry that doesn't just rise upward but inward, like the building is thinking, watching, listening. Architecture at its highest form is not simply built, it is encoded. And in the Gothic movement, particularly during its surge in the 12th and 13th centuries, something was encoded that has never been fully explained. Flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, arches shaped not by whim or beauty but by ratios, recurring proportions. 1 to 1.6, Silk 618. The golden mean. Shapes designed not for human eyes but for something deeper resonance. The great cathedrals, Chartres, Amiens, Reims, are considered masterpieces of sacred design. But look more closely, and something begins to unravel. The positioning of columns, the orientation of light, the asymmetry that only becomes visible when you begin to expect perfection. And beneath these anomalies, a pattern begins to form. Not a flaw, a signature, a hidden hand. The Knights Templar were never credited as architects. They were warriors, monks, bankers. but records show they financed and in many cases oversaw the construction of key Gothic sites. Their money moved unseen, funneled through abbeys and noble patrons into stone and glass and wood. They weren't carving the buildings, but they were directing the chisel. In the south transept of Chartres Cathedral, there is a set of stairs that leads nowhere. A staircase carved into the wall, spiraling up into solid stone. Scholars explain it as a builder's oversight, a relic of a design change. But the staircase is finished. Its edges polished. Someone completed it knowing it would not be used. Unless it was used for something else. At the foot of those steps, carved into a block nearly invisible to the eye, is a tiny circle enclosed by a triangle, an ancient alchemical symbol for spirit within matter. The same symbol appears on the lintel of a long-demolished Templar commandery in Provence, and again hidden in a fresco beneath plaster in a ruined chapel in Portugal. Always in stone, always concealed. Some have called this the fifth mark, a Templar symbol, that was never officially adopted, never worn on tunics, never spoken of in trials. It doesn't appear in any surviving charter, but it appears in stone, quietly, persistently. If it means something, no one has translated it. But its placement is consistent where the eye doesn't naturally fall, but where the structure begins to shift. Architecture that isn't meant to be seen, but felt. A French architect named Jean d'Estrées, writing in 1928, proposed that certain cathedrals were built on acoustic diagrams, that their dimensions were tuned like instruments. Vaults were shaped to trap or reflect specific frequencies. When choirs sang certain harmonics, the walls themselves would vibrate, not metaphorically, but physically. He believed the Templars used this principle not for beauty, but for transmission. Transmission of what? He never said. He disappeared from public life soon after publishing. His final essay, Resonance as Sacrament, was never completed. Other researchers have noted that light enters these cathedrals not randomly, but with precision. Stained glass windows in Chartres display star patterns that align with the positions of Venus at key astronomical moments. One rose window, misnamed, perhaps shows not petals but spirals, logarithmic, infinite, fractals carved into medieval glass. What does this mean? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it's coincidence. Or perhaps the Templars saw buildings not as shelters but as containers. Not for people, but for principles. And not only principles, but presences. A cathedral is not a house of worship. It is a machine of alignment. And if built precisely, it may do more than amplify voice or gather congregation. It may echo something older, something less named. The original blueprints of Notre-Dame de Paris are lost, but fragments survive on vellum on stone in graffiti carved into the scaffold walkways during construction. Among them, a glyph resembling the Templar cross overlaid with an inverted arch. The drawing has no annotation. It appears beside dimensions, not doctrine, as if someone wanted it embedded, not discussed. When fire engulfed Notre Dame in 2019, engineers scanning the damage with thermal imaging discovered something unexpected. Parts of the foundation retained cold far longer than their surroundings. Certain stones resisted heat beyond known material tolerance. No one could explain why. The stones were original, untouched since the 13th century. What were they made of? Or what had they been made to remember? A theory persists, still ridiculed, still unproven, that the Templars used the cathedrals as vaults not for treasure, but for memory. that their true content is not stored in sacristy, but in symmetry, that the buildings themselves are encodings of a story no longer permitted to be told, a story carved not in text, but in weight line and shadow. The Church accepted the cathedrals. It even funded them. But what if unknowingly it also enshrined a heresy, not blasphemy of content, but of form? Because form can betray allegiance. In rhymes, one keystone above a secondary chapel bears a face not of Christ, nor angel, nor king, but of a figure with eyes closed, mouth slightly open, and a hand raised not in blessing, but in silence. No record explains its presence. The masons left no notes. And yet there it remains, worn smooth but never gone. Like a witness to what? To something older than the Church, older than Rome. Something the Templars may not have invented but rediscovered. Preserved not through parchment or speech, but through stone that never forgets. You don't find this story in history books. You feel it when standing at the center of a nave, when light falls at a perfect, impossible angle, when a whisper carries farther than it should. It is not proof. It is suggestion repeating itself in silence. The buildings remember, even when we forget who gave them their shape. The sea remembers in silence. It does not archive like parchment. It does not preserve in language, but it keeps. What falls into its depths is not erased, it is suspended. Time moves differently underwater. Sound travels farther. Light bends. Orientation blurs. And somewhere within that distortion, memory lingers. The Mediterranean, that ancient basin of war trade and belief, has swallowed more than ships. It has swallowed entire stories. And among the quietest of those stories is the one whispered along the seabeds between Cyprus, Malta, and the southern coast of France, a route once frequented by the Knights Templar, but never officially mapped. Their ships were fast, small, built less for cargo than for secrecy. Records of their maritime network are sparse, intentionally vague, and riddled with redactions. But coastal ruins half submerged by rising tides suggest a pattern. Harbors without cities, docks with no adjoining roads, watchtowers aligned to stars rather than shorelines. What were they watching for? In 2009, a marine archaeology team scanning the seabed near Sardinia discovered a rectangular anomaly buried under layers of silt and volcanic stone. What drew their attention wasn't the size or the shape, but the geometry. Too precise. Angles too perfect to be natural. When they sent down cameras, they found something stranger, a stone slab embedded with a cross equal-armed Templar style, surrounded by concentric circles like ripples frozen in stone. No known church or fortification had ever stood at that site. The water above it is over 100 feet deep. Sonar scans revealed a surrounding formation pillars collapsed over time, forming a rough octagon. At its center, a cavity. Not a tomb, not a vault. Empty, but not lifeless. When divers entered, they reported an odd sensation. Their instruments recorded no anomaly, but each diver independently described the same effect: disorientation, a sensation of being watched from below, and an audible hum, low rhythmic pulsing like a breath held too long. Nothing in their equipment detected sound. The site was quietly cordoned off. The discovery never made headlines, but fragments of the dive logs leaked into academic circles. One entry read, "The stone resists time. It's not what it holds. It's what it refuses to give." Was it Templar, perhaps? Perhaps older. The Templars were said to have excavated beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Some believe they unearthed not objects, but knowledge systems of measurement sacred geometry, acoustic resonances, lost to the collapse of ancient civilizations. And perhaps among those measurements were coordinates, not to a destination but to a frequency. Could the sea conceal such frequencies? In Malta, the hypogem of Hal Saflieni, a subterranean temple predating the pyramids, contains a chamber known as the Oracle Room. When a male voice speaks at certain pitches within it, the entire structure vibrates. Frequencies between 95 and 120 hertz cause the walls, floor, and ceiling to hum. Not loudly, not musically, but deeply. Some believe this chamber was built not for sound, but for transformation. Templar activity in Malta is lightly documented. They owned land. They passed through. But no records describe what they did within the ancient structures. And yet, graffiti, faint, near erased, can still be found in side corridors, a cross within a square, a symbol known as quaternio balance, between matter and spirit. Why carve that here? In 1977, a retired naval technician living in Marseille claimed to have intercepted a signal on a homemade receiver, a shortwave pulse, that repeated in perfect intervals, carrying what he described as tones like bells submerged in water. He traced the signal to an offshore coordinate, 42.86 degrees or N 6.22 degrees EE, a point in the Mediterranean with no known infrastructure. When he returned to the spot weeks later, the signal was gone. No official agency confirmed the transmission, but the pattern of the tones when analyzed by a musicologist matched the interval spacing found in the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel's so-called musical cubes. Coincidence noise, or something embedded long ago activated only when the sea aligns. A theory unproven and unspeakable in mainstream academia suggests that the Templars encoded not knowledge, but triggers. That their architecture symbols and roots were not messages, but switches. That certain conditions, location, frequency, timing, might unlock something not physical, but perceptual. What does it mean to see differently? In underwater ruins near Tyre, Lebanon, once a Templar stronghold, divers discovered fragments of mosaics bearing unfamiliar glyphs. Not Phoenician, not Latin. Inverted spirals, crosses formed from repeating dots, and an hourglass shape surrounded by rays. The tiles were dated tentatively to the 13th century, but the style matched no known artisan school. A nearby tablet bore an inscription, Lux sub aqua non pro oculis, light beneath water, not for the eyes. Not for the eyes? Then for what? In medieval mysticism, water was often a metaphor for consciousness. To be submerged was to move beyond surface knowing. Baptism, immersion, descent. But the Templars may have taken this metaphor further, embedding their signals not in metaphor, but in literal depths. Beneath the sea, beneath reach, beneath history. And what if something still listens? In 2021, oceanic sensors picked up rhythmic pulses off the coast of Corsica, human-made but not repeated, like a language without a key. The signal lasted 37 minutes, then ceased. Coordinates matched a stretch once used by Templar convoys moving between Marseille and Acre. No ships were registered in the area at the time. The sea again held its breath. These are not proofs. These are not conclusions. They are driftwood, clues that wash ashore not to confirm but to disturb. And the sea does not argue. It only remembers, in pressure, in silence, in stone that no longer fits the maps drawn above the waves. If the Templars left behind a message, it may not be one we can read. It may be one we have to feel, in the stillness between tides, in the quiet between sonar pings, in the weight of a presence too large to name and too deep to reach. Some days pass like any other, unmarked, forgotten. Others repeat, not through intention but through rhythm, an invisible pulse embedded in the calendar like breath you didn't know you were holding until the silence grows too deep. Friday the 13th is one such day, a superstition, a cultural artifact, a joke for the nervous and the bored. But behind the fear, beneath the ritual warnings, is something else, something misaligned, something that returns not by coincidence, but by design. We're told the superstition began with the fall of the Templars, that on Friday, October 13th, 1307, hundreds of knights were arrested across France in a coordinated sweep. No resistance, no warning, a perfect strike into silence. Since then, the day has worn a shadow, a superstition made of memory too buried to name. But what if the fear remains because the rhythm continues? Mathematically, Friday the 13th is a calendrical anomaly. It occurs more frequently than any other day number pairing. In a Gregorian cycle over centuries, this alignment repeats with peculiar consistency, almost insistence. Once might be chance, twice might be structure, but more than a dozen cycles of recurrence in under 2 decades, that begins to hum. In 1899, a French mathematician named Etienne Baraudot noted this pattern and proposed it followed a 400-year recurrence rule. But his notes also included something stranger, a table of lunar alignments on each Friday the 13th. He circled 3 years, 1307, 1666, and 1947. No explanation. No commentary, just a symbol in the margin, a cross with a broken stem. That symbol later found etched beneath the altar stone of a ruined Templar chapel near Rouen had no liturgical significance. It doesn't appear in Christian iconography, but it does resemble ancient Mesopotamian glyphs used to denote interruptions in linear time moments where divine events entered human chronology sideways. Templars were not astrologers, but they were pattern keepers. Their commanderies followed celestial alignments. Their ceremonies were documented began at twilight or precisely at the crossing point of equinox and solstice lines. Time was not just a container, it was a signal. So what does it mean that the date of their undoing repeats in this specific pattern? In 1983, a historian named Clarice Dumont published a quiet monograph called Calendars of Dissonance Templar Echoes in Secular Time. In it, she proposed that Friday the 13th serves as a mnemonic cipher, not a superstition, but a trigger. A reminder encoded in the flow of days. An invitation to notice when something is slightly off. She pointed to records from 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Multiple executions fell on Friday the 13th. In 1923, a mysterious fire at the Temple Church in London occurred on the same date. In 1964, during a Vatican archive reshuffling 5 volumes of Templar trial records were accidentally incinerated by a heating malfunction on a Friday the 13th. Again and again, that day surfaces like a signal returning to alignment. But why? Templar documents do not directly mention cycles, but certain architectural features hint otherwise. The floor mosaic at the Commandery of Tomar in Portugal includes 13 equidistant symbols surrounding a sunburst. Most interpret it as decorative. But if viewed through temporal mapping software, those points align with the years Friday the 13th occurred 3 times within one Gregorian year, a rare measurable phenomenon, an accident or an instruction. In an encoded letter, dated 12 months before the order's formal dissolution, A Templar knight named Pierre d'Alais wrote from Avignon. The wheel is broken in its motion, but not in its memory. We will not turn again, but the shadows will. Historians interpret this as resignation, but others suggest a different meaning, that the order knew its visibility would end, but not its echo, that they placed within time a kind of mark, a scar, a recurring instability. A calendar, after all, is not neutral. It's a structure, a map of belief. And if that structure can be tuned, can be made to chime at intervals, like a bell tower with no sound, then it becomes more than measurement. It becomes message. We think of time as a line, but the Templars may have viewed it as a lock, with certain dates serving as tumblers. Moments when reality stretched thin might allow for other entries. And Friday the 13th. That may not be unlucky. It may be open. Open to what? No prophecy explains. No scripture warns. But across centuries, certain people have vanished on that date. Certain projects have collapsed. Certain silences have expanded. And always when you look too closely, the pattern dissolves, just enough to keep you from certainty. Just enough to leave you staring at a calendar, wondering why your skin feels colder. In Istanbul's underground basilica cistern, among pillars misaligned with Roman logic, one bears an inscription, Chronos dormiens vigilat. Sleeping time remains awake. The carving has no known author. And it faces east! In the corner of a forgotten archive in Bruges, there exists a manuscript, unsigned, untranslated, partly decayed. It begins not with a preface, but with a diagram, a wheel of months marked not with feast days, but absences. Days when nothing was written, when records ceased, when clocks failed. Most of them are Fridays, most are the 13th. No historian has yet explained why. We cannot say that the Templars encoded a message in the calendar. We cannot say that Friday the 13th is anything more than anomaly. But anomalies, when repeated, become architectures. Architectures without walls, only shadows, only patterns that do not announce themselves except by recurrence. Like a clock that never ticks, but still strikes. Maps are promises. They offer the illusion of clarity. This leads to that north, points upward destinations exist. But not all maps are made to guide. Some are made to confuse, others to conceal, and a few are made not for travel, but for awakening. The kind of map that doesn't point to a place but to a question that can't be asked until the pieces are reassembled. If they ever were whole to begin with. Among the more peculiar artifacts linked to the legacy of the Templars is a collection of disconnected maps scattered across time and geography never mentioned in official records, yet bearing familiar marks. They appear in abbey vaults, private libraries, dusty drawers in universities that have long forgotten their own holdings. Always unlabeled, always undated, and always wrong, not wrong in measurement or location, but in purpose. One fragment discovered in the 17th century, in a monastery near Montségur, depicts a coastal outline that resembles the western edge of Portugal, but rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise, as if the sea pointed inward. Another found in Sicily in 1911 shows a circular landmass surrounded by geometric waves with no reference to any known ocean, no compass rose, no legend. Only a symbol at the center, a cross within a cross folded over itself like a Mobius strip. Templar emblems appear in the margins, not prominently, often buried beneath ink or overwritten by later hands. but when traced, their geometry aligns with patterns seen in Templar fortifications. The same proportions, the same spacing, as if whoever drew them thought in stone but translated through paper. These fragments were dismissed by scholars for centuries, considered curiosities. But in 1984, an independent researcher named Clara Bren isolated 7 surviving fragments across different collections: France, Spain, Germany, and Malta. When she overlaid them not geographically but geometrically, she noticed that the lines, though they did not form a conventional map, aligned according to an unfamiliar order, a spiral, not logarithmic, not Fibonacci, something else. A progression that folded inward, then outward, again reversing itself at each turn. No coordinate system could explain it. But when laid out in a dimly lit room, the drawings cast shadows that curved along the same invisible arc. She called it the inversion path. Clara died in 1992. Her notes were incomplete, but she left behind one final annotation scrawled in the margins of her last letter. It's not where they went. It's where they no longer needed to be. What kind of map describes departure, not destination? The answer may lie in how the Templars moved. Their known routes through Europe, the Holy Land, and the Mediterranean formed more than just trade or battle lines. When plotted across certain celestial events, eclipses, equinoxes, planetary conjunctions, they align. Not all, not perfectly, but too many for comfort. A commandery in Provence sits directly beneath a recurring lunar node. Another in Aragon, abandoned for centuries, was built in exact alignment with the rising of Sirius at midsummer, a star long associated with rebirth in Egyptian cosmology. Coincidence or cartography? In a sealed vault beneath the monastery of Tomar, a wall fresco faded nearly to oblivion depicts a spiral of stone arches, each labeled with symbols instead of names. A sequence, not of cities, but of states. The outermost ring bears the sign for materia matter, the next sanguis blood, deeper still verbum word, and at the center a blank, not a symbol, a silence. Perhaps the map was never meant to be followed. Perhaps it was meant to be felt. In the 13th century, a Templar scribe named Theodoric de Calvi wrote of paths that do not cross land or sea, but are cut through understanding. He described veins beneath the skin of the world, known only to those who could read the intervals between form. His writings were banned, his records burned, but a single phrase survives in a later chronicle. The map is not of the world. It is of forgetting. Forgetting what? That's the question that surfaces each time another piece appears. In 2005, a private collector in Vienna unearthed what appeared to be a navigational chart etched onto a slate tablet identical in style to Templar surveying stones used in fortress construction. But it lacked all topography. No rivers, no mountains, only curves, echoes, repeating notations in no known alphabet. One symbol recurred 9 times, 2 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash. When mirrored, it resembles the Greek letter chi X, a common mark for the unknown. But in this chart, it appeared in the same relative position each time: a junction, a turning, or perhaps a fold. Cartographers dismissed the slate as metaphor. But what if it isn't a map of where? What if it's a map of when? We think of time as linear, but the Templars may not have. Their architecture bends it, light falling at precise moments of the year, shadows cast only during specific celestial alignments. Their rituals, shrouded in secrecy, were timed not to holy days, but to solstices, equinoxes, and crossings. If they mapped time as they mapped land, then what we call fragments might be intentional, pieces scattered deliberately to be found only when enough time has passed for someone to see the structure hidden in the disarray. Not a map for navigation, a map for awakening. So we ask again, where were they going? Nowhere, because the map leads not away, but inward, into perception, into a state of awareness that breaks orientation, that removes north, south, east, west, and replaces them with presence, absence, silence, and return. One medieval commentary, unsigned, speaks of the map that ends the journey by beginning it backwards. A puzzle or a prayer. We may never assemble the full picture, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the pieces are not meant to unite. Maybe each fragment is a mirror, and each time we hold one, it shows us not the way forward, but the place we are already standing, seen from the angle we were not supposed to notice. Symbols were never meant to be neutral. They carry, they cut, they fold belief into form. But over time, they also fracture. They are adopted, co-opted, inverted. What once pointed upward begins to spiral inward. What once meant one thing begins to mean another. And somewhere between what is seen and what is said, a gap opens. A silence. A betrayal. The Templars operated within a system they outwardly served the Catholic Church. And yet many of their symbols resist neat interpretation. The red cross on white was not exclusive to them, but their usage, square, equal-armed crimson like dried blood, spoke not of sacrifice, but of threshold. In older traditions, a cross with arms of equal length was not a Christian symbol at all. It was solar, pagan, elemental, a representation of balance of the four cardinal points of the world before doctrine. So what happens when a symbol crosses the boundary between systems of belief? It carries residue, and residue stains. In the trial transcripts, we read that Templars were accused of spitting on the cross, of denying Christ, of worshipping idols, dismissed by most as fabrications, inventions of the Inquisition's theater. But buried in the repetitive absurdity of the charges lies a thread not that they rejected faith, but that they operated under a different definition of it, one that was older and colder. A fragment of testimony from a captured knight in Poitiers describes a ceremony where initiates were told, "This is not what it seems. The symbol is not the thing." If true, this suggests a radical reframing, that the Templars, or at least some of them, did not see the cross as sacred in itself, but as a placeholder, a marker. And that kind of thinking unravels everything. The Church taught that symbols transmit grace. The Templars, it seems, may have seen them as containers, empty until activated. In the ruins of a Templar commandery near Béarn, carved into the underside of a stone altar, is a symbol that does not appear in any ecclesiastical register. It is an eye, but not open, not closed, half-lidded. Sleeping, perhaps. Above it, a thin line broken at one end, interpreted by some as the veil, a Gnostic motif for the boundary between worlds. Others see it as the division between word and meaning. This symbol is echoed in only one known place in a 14th century alchemical codex, now housed in Krakow. There it is drawn beside the phrase credere est videre, to believe is to see. Not the inverse, not seeing is believing, a subtle inversion, but one with consequences, because in that reversal symbol no longer points outward. It turns, reflects, loops, much like a mirror placed in front of another mirror, reflecting into itself forever. In certain Templar structures, geometry follows this logic. The Church of the Vera Cruz in Segovia, attributed to the order, is a dodecagonal structure. 12 sides, not aligned to the cross, but to the zodiac. The ceiling vaults form a spiral. The windows admit light at odd angles, most notably at dawn, on the spring equinox, when a single beam illuminates the center of the floor, where nothing stands. No altar, no icon, just empty space. A blank, sacred by omission. A void as symbol. Other churches built under Templar influence show similar anomalies. Doorways that lead nowhere. Staircases that descend into sealed stone. Carvings of animals without biblical relevance, snakes swallowing themselves, lions with closed mouths, birds without wings. It's not heresy, it's dissonance, a slow erosion of meaning, symbols drifting from their linguistic anchors. In the Templar necropolis in Llanlef, Brittany, multiple gravestones are marked not with names, but with spirals and concentric squares. No dates, no prayers. One stone bears only a single line in Latin loquitur, per figuram, it speaks through form. But to speak through form is to bypass language, and to bypass language is to bypass control. If the church was built on the word, then to invert that to place symbol above word is to dethrone the logos. To allow for meanings that shift, that move, that never settle. The result is a theology of discomfort, and discomfort spreads. In the margins of a Vatican folio dated 13 to 15, a scribe left a note in red ink, signum est pestis, si non firmatur in verbo. A symbol is a plague if not anchored in the word. Anxiety. Not at a doctrine denied, but at a doctrine reframed. The Templars, it seems, did not reject God. They rejected the certainty of how he was named. Their rituals, where recorded, contain little prayer, no consistent liturgy, more gesture than speech, more structure than song. The initiation described in multiple testimonies focuses not on sin or grace, but on silence. A touch to the lips, a circle drawn in ash, a refusal to explain. And perhaps it is that refusal that the Church could not tolerate. Not the content, but the ambiguity, because in ambiguity power dissipates. The faithful cannot follow a symbol that moves. And yet across Europe, their symbols persisted long after the Templars vanished. Carved into wells, hidden in stained glass, scratched into the stone of barns and bridges, quiet, enduring, misunderstood. Over time, meanings decayed. The cross became just a cross. The spiral, just a decoration. The triangle, just a design. But beneath the surface, tension remained. A fracture between symbol and word. A rift between expression and authority. And that fracture left untended began to pulse. It pulses still. Not loudly, not clearly, but in those moments when you stare at a symbol too long, and it begins to look back. At the end of all structures there is silence. Not absence, not failure, just the moment where form no longer carries meaning, where geometry collapses, language unthreads, and what remains is not knowledge but residue. The kind that lingers in the corners of memory and breath held just too long in questions never asked aloud. This is where the story of the Templars ends, not with a revelation, but with a recognition that something is missing, and always has been. For centuries, scholars have looked for closure, for the treasure, for the scroll, for the final record that confirms the purpose, the truth, the secret at the heart of the order. But the further they dig, the more fragmented the pieces become. Every archive yields contradiction. Every theory meets another that cancels it. The narrative folds in on itself over and over, until it becomes not a path, but a spiral. There is no center, just descent. In an unmarked vault beneath the British Library, there exists a manuscript catalogued only by symbol, an inverted cross overlaying a circle. No date, no author. Its pages contain no words, only diagrams. Arches within arches, keys drawn upside down, a series of mirrored staircases, each leading to nowhere. The final page bears a single shape, a door surrounded by silence. The caption below, scrawled in faint Latin, nulla reditus, nulla introitus, solum memoria. No return, no entry, only memory. Is it Templar? There's no proof, but the tone is familiar, the absence recognizable. What we know: the Templars rose fast, then vanished faster. Their power dissolved not by battle but by erasure, their wealth relocated, their doctrines diluted, their symbols stripped of complexity and hung on souvenir walls. But what if that was the plan? Not the fall, but the dispersal. In physics, the concept of decoherence refers to the loss of information not because it disappears, but because it becomes unmeasurable. Spread too thin, scattered into contextless fragments, intact in total, but inaccessible in parts. Perhaps the Templar project was not to protect a thing, but to ensure its unreadability, to encode something across geography, time, architecture, bloodlines, calendars, symbols, songs, silences, until no one person, no one generation could assemble it again. A safety, a containment field made of culture itself. If so, it worked. We are still chasing the outline of something we cannot define, still finding staircases that go nowhere, altars without names, crosses that don't align to doctrine rituals missing half their script. And when we ask, what were the Templars hiding, we're answering ourselves. Because the moment we ask is the moment the structure reasserts itself, empty, quiet, powerful, a shadow cast by something that never declared its shape. Some believe they found a truth too large to carry. Others think they preserved not facts, but conditions, the preconditions for awakening, for seeing the world differently. Not better, just more fully, less filtered, unfused from authority. This would explain the silence, the refusal to explain, the way their legacy evades fixation. In 2017, a team of researchers digitally reconstructed dozens of Templar sites across Europe using laser scanning. When layered together, something strange occurred. The structures spanning centuries and thousands of miles formed an almost congruent pattern, a tessellated net of equilateral spacing nearly impossible to achieve without aerial knowledge. There was no reason for it, no strategic advantage. And yet, the alignment held. They published the findings. The scientific community ignored them. The files remain online. And the net still hums. The Templar project, if there was one, may never have been about defending pilgrims or Jerusalem or relics. It may have been about building something slowly, secretly beyond language, an architecture of uncertainty, a structure of unknowing. It does not reward belief. It does not punish doubt. It just persists. When you trace the final years of the order, what emerges is not collapse. It's a fade, a controlled retreat, assets dispersed, members absorbed, names changed. But nothing feels abrupt. Everything feels choreographed. Even Jacques de Molay's death, burned on an island, eyes locked toward Notre Dame, feels less like martyrdom and more like punctuation. Not an end, just a mark left hanging. And what comes after that mark? Stillness. And then the replicas begin. Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, orders that echo but do not repeat, that quote but do not remember. New rituals built atop erased blueprints, lost foundations, fake legends placed over older truths. But a replica implies an original, even if the original never reveals itself. And that's what makes the Templar myth so powerful. It refuses to resolve. It denies closure. Every answer opens more. Every certainty splits. Every structure once studied long enough begins to warp, until all that's left is a lingering unease. Not fear, not awe, just the feeling that something didn't finish. In a Templar chapel, ruin outside Girona, carved into a slab of stone beneath what was once the lectern, there are 5 words. Hoc non est fini, iterum. This is not the end, again. No one knows who etched them. No one claims responsibility. The letters are weathered, but not worn. And each year at midsummer the sunlight cuts through the broken ceiling and lands on the slab. For exactly 47 seconds. A signal. Or just light. There's no way to be sure. Only that the stone remains. And the inscription holds. Because some endings are not conclusions. They are thresholds. Not meant to be crossed, only approached. And stood before in silence.